Sunday, and instead of sharing my weekly update, I want to go ahead and share some of the stuff I've learned regarding my research into Germany's constitution known as the Grundgesetz, or the Basic Law. I want to do a comparison video on how that compares to the country I'm from, the United States, and the US Constitution, and I want to kind of compare and contrast the two. I would like to see what makes the German Constitution unique in its own aspects, and how some might argue it might even give more protections and rights than the US Constitution does. So with that said, let's get to it. So before I kind of delve into the US Constitution, I want to give some backstory and just some origins to how the US Constitution was adopted and is now the supreme law of the United States. So the framers, when they declared independence from Britain and they won the Revolutionary War, a lot of them were very conflicted in terms of what this new government would be for the United States after it basically got rid of the monarchy, overseeing the 13 colonies. It's important to note that when the U.S. was first started, it really wasn't a United States in the sense of these states belonging to one single unified country. Rather, it was a confederation. In a sense, all the states acted like independent countries, and they would only negotiate when it came to wars. They would probably form an alliance with each other, or if it was for the common good of all these mini countries. So the U.S. actually created the Articles of Confederation as its first constitution, but then that kind of failed, so then they had to create a national government along with some states' governments, and then in addition to that, all the amendments to the Constitution, which gives us the current U.S. Constitution. It's important to note that the U.S. Constitution is actually the second oldest constitution in the world that's still in existence today, right behind San Marino in Europe. The framers were inspired by many things. The first thing was the Greek and Roman civilizations in the ancient times in Europe, how those formed democracies, republics, direct democracies, and even some kingdoms. And they also got some inspiration from the religious movements that really ruled over Europe, the Middle East, North Africa, and parts of Asia. And actually the religious governments was a model for the framers to not incorporate into the U.S. because they want to create a country where the U.S. would basically not be under a particular religion or creed. It would be a secular government. And they also got ideas from the Enlightenment period, specifically from philosophers like John Locke, Rousseau, Hobbes, a lot of these enlightened people that were really active in Europe and tried to kind of change the monarchies in Europe to nation states and nationalism. However, the most influential things that really gave rise to the U.S. Constitution was the English customs and traditions that were passed down from its predecessor in Britain. Because the U.S. was a British colony, it had a lot of British laws and customs that inspired it to adopt out of and create something of its own. So the English Bill of Rights and Magna Carta would be probably the two biggest documents that really gave rise to the U.S.'s foundation as a government and as a new nation for people. And a lot of its traditions, customs, and justice systems really reflect that of Old English common law, which was already practiced in England for centuries ahead. So really it was, for the most part, it was kind of like if it ain't broke, don't fix it, except with these tiny small cracks and nuggets, we're going to fill those in with our own ideas. But really a lot of the U.S. Constitution comes from Old English common law, and you can see that in the writings themselves. For example, in the English Bill of Rights, the Eighth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which prohibits cruel, unusual punishments and fines and excessive bail, as well as the right to bear arms, was almost a direct copy and paste from the English Bill of Rights, which protected Protestant minorities during a Catholic rule in England. You also had some inspiration from state documents such as the Virginia Declaration of Rights and the Massachusetts Charter and Declaration of Rights, which were state constitutions that predated the U.S. Constitution and were mostly written by some of the framers who were ahead of those states during that time. Now, when it comes to the U.S. Constitution, it's really broken down to the legislative, executive, and judicial branch, and then the rest of the document essentially just reaffirms treaties like extradition. It has a 3/5 clause, and then it also has the supremacy clause and the clause which states that this U.S. is going to be a republic, and the rest of the U.S. is essentially amendments that came after it was ratified by 9 out of the 13 states. The reason why it wasn't in the original Constitution is because the framers really were in a rush to just get this new government established. And then the preceding amendments, such as the rights we know of about the U.S., like freedom of speech, freedom of the press, right to a jury trial, protection from cruel and unusual punishment, rights against unreasonable searches and seizures, and stuff like that, would come later on. And then throughout the U.S.'s history, you had other amendments that showed up, such as the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery and involuntary servitude except as a punishment for crime. You had a lot of voting rights that were given to people. The voting threshold was lowered. You had rights that prohibited alcohol, and then the rights that kind of went against the prohibition of alcohol, such as the 18th and 21st Amendment, because they cancel each other out. So really, in total, the U.S. Constitution was really amended over the 249 years of the country, maybe like 15 or 17 times, because 10 of them came at once, which were the Bill of Rights, and the rest of them followed after major socio-political events throughout the country. And the U.S. hasn't had an amendment to the Constitution since 1992, which just required that if people in Congress want to get a raise, they would have to wait until the next election cycle to get that raise. But ever since then, the U.S. Constitution has not been amended at all in the 21st century. Certainly there are some issues with the U.S. Constitution. Many of them are like the vague rights that are not really specified in the document. Another one is slavery. For example, the 13th Amendment, although it prohibited slavery civilly, it still allowed slavery and involuntary servitude as criminal punishment, which gave rise to the prison-industrial complex, which is something that a lot of people are advocating for its removal of, regarding the exceptions clause. There's also voting rights. The death penalty is still in there. In the U.S. Constitution, the 5th and 14th Amendment prohibits the loss of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So once due process of law has been given, then someone's life can be taken away. And overall, a lot of other countries, in the way they kind of look at this document, is it's really expired and it's out to date, and it really needs to be updated and reintegrated into the modern terms and modern societal norms. But in order to do that, you would need to amend it, which, as the number of states kept growing in the country, the threshold required to amend the Constitution has become that much more difficult. And in today's world, because of our divided political situation, it's seen as basically impossible practically to have any amendments to the U.S. Constitution. And again, it's also a nationalistic document, so it only pertains to the people of the United States. The first 7 words of the U.S. Constitution are "We, the people of the United States." So it's a document that benefits only an exclusive group of people and really ignores the rest of the world, the other 95% of the world, because the majority of the world is not from the U.S. or U.S. citizens. So there's also some issues with that if you look at it in terms of the humanitarian aspect, that we should be a global society caring about everybody instead of a particular creed, culture, or background. So that's pretty much sums up like the origins and how the U.S. Constitution came to be and stuff like that. And now I want to focus on Germany's. Now, Germany is as old as pretty much time itself. It goes all the way back to the Roman empires, where you had these tribes and polities and small kingdoms that acted really as nations. But in the sense, the modern German state that we know of today did not exist until the unification of Germany in the late 1800s by Otto von Bismarck. Before that, Germany was really just a collotted polities of many countries and many kingdoms, each ruled by their own princely states or chief executives. And essentially it was a conglomeration of these independent countries with some linguistic differences. It wasn't until Martin Luther, which was the Protestant reformer in Germany, standardized the German language, which kind of created a unity amongst those small polities into speaking a common German dialect. And then again, Otto von Bismarck unifying all these kingdoms within Germany into one big Germany, that people can kind of get the idea of how that state was created. Additionally, you had the short-lived Weimar Republic after the unification of Germany, which essentially was Germany's first step towards creating a democracy. Before the Weimar Republic, Germany had a king called the Kaiser, and Wilhelm II was the last Kaiser, or a king of Germany, and his seat basically dissolved in 1918 when the Weimar Republic came into place. And the Weimar Republic had a similar constitution to that of the U.S. with its own separate branches of government and equal rights and stuff like that. But it was during a very heated political time in Europe, given that not long after, the Nazi regime came into power and actually used emergency powers from the Weimar Republic's constitution, which gave rise to the Nazi regime. Now, what's really interesting is during the regime of the Nazis, the Weimar Republic's constitution was actually still existing, and it was still the document of Germany. The only difference, though, is the emergency powers in the Weimar Republic were given to the Nazis so that they can have complete control over the entire government, were never given back or never dissolved. So essentially, they were eternal emergency powers given to the Nazis to abuse and utilize to their advantage, which resulted in the death of millions of people, created wars, and unnecessary destruction for humanity. After the Nazi regime collapsed with the help of the Allies and the Soviet Union, Germany was split in two between East and West Germany, and then Berlin was also split between East Berlin and West Berlin. And then after German reunification, once the Soviet Union collapsed, resulted in a new constitution for Germany, where the Weimar Republic constitution was basically scrapped. All those emergency powers, all the Nazi regimes were pretty much gone. And the constitution was actually a mixture of what the Western allies, such as the US, Great Britain, and France, wanted this new Germany to have. And it essentially created the modern German constitution that we see today, with a federal government, a state government, and a federation system. And a lot of these rights that are seen in the German constitution really seek inspiration from these countries, as the UK, the US, and France during that time were seen as the beacon of human rights amongst the world. And what's really interesting to me is this process called denazification between the adoption of the new constitution and the unification of Germany. A lot of those people that held positions in the regime were completely converted to the idea of maintaining human dignity, human rights, and the vulnerabilities of too much of an authoritative government and what that can do with the rights of people. So it really gave a lot of change when it came to the treatment of not only people living civilly, but people who are incarcerated, people who are on parole, a lot of people who are marginalized and stigmatized in society. The Germans really took a complete 180 from what they thought as subhumans who were supposed to be dead to people that had certain rights that can never be taken away from them, even more so than the United States Constitution grants. That's really amazing. And I wish that's something that the US would have considered, but it seems like the US is going kind of more backwards while Germany's kind of more progressing. When Germany was split into two, they had two constitutions. The one I'm referring to regarding this new constitution for Germany was that of West Germany. East Germany had a constitution, but it was very influenced by Soviet communism. And after the fall of the Soviet Union and German reunification, those Eastern German states ratified the West German constitution, which basically became the Grundgesetz, or in Germany, the fundamentals or ground laws for the country as a whole. Now, what I would like to do is just kind of tell you some of the rights that are in the first 20 articles of the German Constitution. In the US, we have the Bill of Rights, which essentially cover things like the right to freedom of speech, right to a jury trial, protection from cruel and unusual punishment, but it's really limited and it's very vague in terms of the rights it gives. Although the Ninth Amendment does say that there are certain rights that are not in the Constitution in the US and they are given to the people in the states, that's just a very vague interpretation, and it's not as detailed as Germany's when it comes to protections, rights, and treatment of people. So I really want to kind of highlight that the first article that Germany starts out with is the protection of human dignity, and how that serves as the foundation for its founding, and how every civil, executive, judicial, and legislative body in Germany has to respect the inviolability of human dignity. And that's something that everybody has a right to, and it's not even a right in the US Constitution. There is no right to human dignity in the US Constitution, but Germany actually starts out with that right to really remind itself of this new emerging state it kind of grew out of. Another right that is there in the German Grundgesetz is the right to personal freedom, so long as it does not violate the rights of others. And that's something that's not really seen in the US Constitution when it comes to freedoms. Germany's constitution also mentions all people are equal before the law. That doesn't say anything in the U.S. Bill of Rights. You have the freedom of faith and conscience, which faith is mentioned in the U.S. Constitution in the First Amendment, but this conscience is not mentioned in the U.S. Constitution. It is mentioned in Germany, as well as to express yourself and arts and sciences. Now, the U.S. Constitution does mention arts and sciences, but that's regarding the power Congress has when it comes to granting like copyright protections for people's individual contributions in arts and science. But Germany's constitution establishes that as a human right that cannot be taken away. The German constitution also gives the right to having children, being married, and having a family. There's really nothing about that in the U.S. Constitution. There's even a school system, an educational system. Education is a right. In the U.S., it's not a right. It's considered a luxury privilege, but it's owned by the state in Germany, and everybody's entitled to education. And that's very different compared to the U.S. Of course, you have some similarities, such as like the Articles goes on to say that people have the right to peacefully assemble and associate. Those kind of come from the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. But again, those assemblies and peaceful demonstrations cannot incite violence or be any crime or violate the rights of other people. And you also have the right to privacy in Germany. In the U.S., there is nothing regarding the right to privacy in the Constitution. Some might stipulate the Fourth Amendment's interpretation to be that way, but as the conservative Supreme Court basically agrees that there is no right to privacy. And that's more of an interpretation issue in the U.S., whereas in Germany, it's clearly written in there with no ambiguity. You also have the freedom of movement. In Germany, you have the right to move wherever you want to, and even in German jails and prisons, if somebody escapes, the police don't go after them because that's considered part of the freedom of movement. So it even applies to people who are incarcerated, which is really amazing given that the U.S. prison system doesn't have any laws like that. Occupational freedom is another right in Germany, so you have the right to be any profession you want as long as you're able to meet those criteria, which again it's not really specified in the U.S. system, neither in the Department of Labor for the U.S. The home, inviolability of the home, is something I would say is similar because in the Third Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, it prohibits soldiers from quartering in people's homes, but it is not really specify the home as someone's property, whereas in Germany it is an actual right, and everybody has this concept of a home. It may not be a physical home, but that might tie into just the right of privacy and the right to your own space in Germany. There are obviously exceptions, like if there's danger going on in the house or if there is a crime, then that's different. But overall, it kind of guarantees that right. The right to property, which is mentioned in the U.S. Constitution and in Germany as well. So that's kind of like a similarity. It even protects deprivation of citizenship and deportation. So no Germans who are German citizens will be deported against their will or be extradited. In the U.S., we don't have like a law that prohibits that or encourages that, so it's not really in the U.S. Constitution, but it is in the German basic law. And the right to asylum. In the U.S., there is no right to asylum. International law has the right to asylum, and in the German Constitution, they also have a right to asylum as well. They have the right to petition, which is to basically address your complaints or grievances with the legislator, very similar to the First Amendment's petition against certain grievances that people may have incurred. So that's kind of a similarity. And it basically goes on to say that there shall be no law made that the basic rights should be diminuted or restricted unless there's a very good and compelling reason to. And if the rights are violated, then the person has the right to go to court and basically sue the government for a violation of these rights in the basic rights, the first 20 rights. And it also gives Germans kind of like the protection for anybody who wants to abolish these basic rights, the right to prevent that. So you have the right and a duty to protect these basic rights against other threats that either the German government or any other force is trying to exploit. And then it goes on to say political parties. Another one is the protection of land animals, which is not in the U.S. Constitution at all. It has a law that protects certain rights that animals have and plants have, and also the European Union rights because Germany is a member state of the European Union. But what's really interesting is in Germany, these basic laws are what are considered eternal clauses. So these are clauses that can never, for any reason, regardless of the state of Germany, be taken away. They can be added to and expanded upon, but they can never be taken away. And if the German people ever were to write a new constitution, then these foundational basic rights, these first 20 articles, the basic law, would have to be included in the new German constitution. So this is like kind of a safeguard that Germany has in order to prevent the country from ever going back to a totalitarian regime like it did in the 1940s. So that's really something that I think is amazing. In the US, we don't have anything that really resembles going back to the past or the troubles of going back to the past. And it's really interesting to kind of compare these things. A few other things in Germany is their justice system. So they really focus a lot on rehabilitation and not punishment. Their sentences are much more shorter. People who are convicted don't lose any of the rights they have. Maybe the only right that they may lose is the right to kind of go wherever they want. But even if they escape, that freedom of movement they can use. They also have a right against life imprisonment. The maximum penalty in Germany a person can face, no matter how high the crime is 15 years maximum. And Germany also abolished the death penalty. So a lot of these reforms in the justice system in Germany are really amazing compared to the justice systems really accomplished in the U.S. I mean, for crying out loud, slavery is still legal in the U.S. as criminal punishment, and it's outlawed in Germany. People who are incarcerated in Germany are not exploited for their labor. And it's a really interesting comparison because the U.S. is a much older constitution, and it really hasn't been expanded upon to the present day because it's so hard to amend, whereas Germany went from the monster it did in the 1900s within the span of like 15, 20 years, going from a beacon of human rights, democracy, and protection of human dignity. And that's something that really amazes me and really makes me proud of what Germany has done. And really is kind of like what inspires me about Germany's constitution versus the U.S. Constitution. Whereas Germany is seeing a lot more progressive and forward-thinking when it comes to societal progress and recognizing its mistakes and giving more protections to all people, regardless of their status. Whereas in the U.S., we are becoming more exclusionary, more discriminating, and under Trump's America, probably more dehumanizing. Will Germany continue to be the beacon of human rights for Europe? Or will it also kind of slowly be like the U.S., where it dwindles away those rights? We're already seeing like the rise of right-wing populism in Germany, anti-immigration sentiment, protection from Islamism and terrorism in Germany. In the U.S., we are seeing a lot under Trump's agendas with the stripping of these rights and the courts pretty much guaranteeing Trump's actions, as Trump basically has control of Congress and the Supreme Court now. So it's really going to be interesting to see what the future holds. But for the time being, I really respect Germany for what they have done. They have come a long way and really tried their best to solidify human rights through their Grundgesetz and individual abilities. Many thanks, and cheers.